The holiday season is here, but this time of year is not always a joyous occasion for some, for a variety of reasons. Grieving the loss of a loved one, a recent divorce, or separation from someone serving overseas. I'm News 3's Kurt Williams, and I sit down with a local therapist about navigating a time of year that normally means bringing your family together.
There are all kinds of emotions tied up in the holidays. They're memorable events. They're events that are tied to family, and they're difficult when there's been disruptions in the family, when there's been death.
Sometimes that absence is tied to a military family member on deployment or the result of a separation in a marriage or another reason, says local therapist Michael Scott.
The tough emotions associated with the holidays, the grief, the hard memories, those can be dealt with by talking. Those can be dealt with by things like journaling. I would say honoring in some way that grief.
What do you mean honoring the feelings?
So when I say honoring them, I mean allowing us to feel them, giving yourself the permission or the grace, if you will, to feel heavy.
The person that maybe their way of coping is to throw up the facade. Everything's fine. What do you want to say to those people?
Sometimes when we put those facades up, when we put on a front, it can feel lonely underneath. It's diminishing your ability to be authentic with the people that you care most about. It's helpful to give it attention, to do something with it rather than ignore it.
Say, for instance, it was like a big family tradition to go to the Norfolk Botanical Gardens or whatever kind of holiday experience. Do you now avoid those, or do you try to go with them with someone else?
Well, it's a great question. One, to acknowledge that it's a tradition that's now in some way different. If a loved one is absent from that for some reason, death or deployment or whatever, there's a recognition that this tradition has changed in some way. I like to emphasize the value of purposefully modifying the tradition, so that one, you're not trying to recreate a tradition that can't be recreated, but recognizing if we modify the tradition in some way, if we add to it or make it unique to the new situation, then we can recognize there's an effort to honor the missing person.
What do you say to someone who is dealing with grief and is, tempted to really just kind of shut the whole holiday experience down?
To look for the cues that would invite you to either push a little harder or to have that grace. And if you're finding that you're judging their grief in some way, that's an indicator for yourself to take a step back. I think it's important to recognize that every grieving process is different.
Are you a fan of I just need to be busy, so I just need to do a number of different things so that I don't have time to sit and really kind of dwell on it?
It's one coping mechanism, and it can be useful at times, but sometimes it just kicks the can down the road.
At some point, Scott says,
I'm one to recognize from the start, anytime I encounter someone who is suffering in some way or hurting in some way, to acknowledge that therapy can be a helpful thing.
What's a good way to suggest someone needs therapy?
While someone might take offense to it, and that's certainly reasonable, especially given the stigma for it, at least the ice has been broken, the topic's been broached. It can be a passive drop a seed and hope the seed grows. It can be a collective effort of, hey, family, I dropped the seed, listen for opportunities to reinforce it. And if it's coming from a place of I care, and that person receives the word of I care, then great. And perhaps that seed then will grow. If it comes from a place of judgment, it'll get rejected. Now, if they're suffering in silence and you're concerned that they may be going to a darker place or outright considering something like suicide or harming themselves in some way, when do we draw the line between we hang back and be passive and accepting, or at what point do we impose? And I'd say it's at the point where you're indeed concerned, and that concern is genuine.
An important reminder, the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline is 988. And Scott, who's a local therapist with ThriveWorks, stresses part of this battle is erasing the stigma of getting therapy and being transparent. Kurt Williams, News 3.